Hello everyone, I'm the rector of Grenoble University and also a sleep expert. It's important to understand that sleep is very well characterized, but to some extent some of the mechanisms are still unknown. The first thing I want to illustrate is the fact that we classify what we call sleep stages using polysomnography, and this is an example of what is an hypnogram on the basis of 8 hours. So you see here the sleep stages that have been scored on the basis of 20 or 30 seconds. It needs to monitor electroencephalogram, electromyogram, electrooculogram, and on the basis of these different signals we stage the sleep. We have then the stage 1 and 2, or represent slow wave sleep, and deep sleep, which is stage 3, and also the red bars, which represent REM sleep, the sleep stage in which essentially we dream. It might maybe surprise you, but the role of sleep are still partly unknown. We believe that it's important to sleep, and there are many researchers worldwide who are still working very hard on elucidating the detailed role of sleep. One function, very clearly, is what we call brain activity maintenance. The idea is to maintain a cerebral energy balance, and of course it is important to withdraw all the information that you accumulate during the day, apart the one that you want to memorize. And of course sleep is also important for consolidating learning and memorization. This is particularly true for REM sleep. These are some of the detailed mechanism that has been described. You see here some synaptic connections in which we see some protein projections, protein synthesis that are specific of the different states of vigilance. So they are different between wake, non-REM sleep, and REM sleep. And some of these protein syntheses are characteristic of some function that are consolidated during sleep, like memory or consolidation of learning. This is another very important function, which is resting the cardiovascular system. During the night, and specifically during slow wave sleep, there is a reduction in cardiac frequency, in also blood pressure, and as a result of cardiac output. And you see that this is related to a reduction in sympathetic activity, and by the way, an increase in parasympathetic activity. This is very important because this is probably one of the major changes of the body functions, and of course it is probably important to preserve the health of both heart and vessels. On the opposite, during REM sleep there is an increase in sympathetic activity, and there is as a consequence an increase in heart rhythm and blood pressure. Another important function is the specific endocrine secretions that occur during sleep. There is usually a correlation between what we call circadian rhythm on the base of 24 hours and some of these endocrine secretions, but some of the hormones are specifically secreted during some sleep stages, like for instance slow wave sleep. And this is, for instance, the case of the growth hormone. Growth hormone is of course important for children, but it's also important in adults, where it plays an important metabolic role. As you all know, sleep is changing with aging. There is a majority of REM sleep during childhood, essentially the first or 2 first years of life. And then, which of course creates some vulnerability, but it's also important for brain maturation. And then REM sleep is drastically decreased, and you see a progressive decline in slow wave sleep with nearly a disappearance for essentially the males after 60 years old. This is probably important for the different functions that I've mentioned, but it is still to be completely understood. One of the major things, and I want to insist on that, is that there is a change in behavior in the modern societies. And for example, in the United States, during the second half of the 20th century, sleep duration has decreased by about 2 hours, and the proportion of adults sleeping less than 7 hours is much increased, reaching nearly 40%. This is important, although there is no ideal duration of sleep. But we know that there is an individual optimal duration that has to be determined. In France, it is the same tendency, and this is, for example, one study that have been performed looking at adults between 25 and 45-year-old, where you see that 45% of this population considered that they didn't sleep enough, and nearly 20% accumulated a significant, what you call, debt of sleep, which has consequences as we will see. One of the consequences is the changes in the reaction times and also the attention capacities. And this is illustrated by these two figures where you see that increasing the sleep deprivation, meaning that you reduce your total sleep time on the 24-hour basis, is actually changing the reaction time. And this is, of course, essential in what we call complex activities. This can be driving, which needs, of course, a divided attention and some very complex mechanism at the brain level, but also, of course, on lots of professional activities that require a high level of vigilance. Another very important feature associated with sleep reduction is the risk of hypertension. And you see here, but then when your total sleep time is reduced, there is an increase in blood pressure and a higher risk of hypertension. This is, of course, something that has to be considered in the context of sleep health. And to illustrate that, not only blood pressure is changed regarding sleep duration, but also other markers like, for instance, the incidence of coronary artery calcifications. And you can see here that when your sleep time is reduced, there is a higher incidence of coronary artery calcification, which of course has implications for the future of our heart and vessels. Also, there is an association with between sleep duration and obesity, and you can see here that there is an increase in the incidence in obesity and the reduction in total sleep time in the general population context. This is probably related to very marked changes in hormonal activities, and for instance, there is a reduction in leptin, which is an hormone that modifies satiety and also has an important impact on the body weight control, and also other hormonal activity are changed, and this probably is what is supporting the increase in body weight that is associated with sleep deprivation. And as a consequence, there is a higher incidence of what we call metabolic syndrome, which is a syndrome associating resistance to insulin and obesity and other factors. You can see here that there is a U shape in this curve, where when you reduce your total sleep time, you increase the prevalence or incidence of metabolic syndrome. And this is on the left part of the figure. And on the right part, you see that this is also the case when you have a higher higher sleep duration, but this is more related to diseases that create hypersomnia. And as a consequence, when you look at insomnia, insomnia can exist with or without reduction in total sleep time. And you can see that when you have both insomnia and reduction in total sleep time, you have an increased risk of an increased cardiovascular and metabolic risk. This is also the case for other consequences, the psychiatric consequences of insomnia. But you can see here that it is both true for this characteristic like anxiety or depression, but also the cardiovascular metabolic profile. As a consequence, I hope that these different elements can illustrate how sleep is important. This is not only true for a disease that actually alter sleep quantity and sleep quality, but also the fact that when you are deprived of sleep, which might be the result of our way of living or way of working in this society, this has important consequences for health.